kind of work that Ruth and the university sector is doing is that many people are denied access to sport and recreation in what is in fact public open space. So why does this happen? How does it happen? And it's in my observation, having been very much part of local government, it's a historical matter. It's to do with contracting, it's to do with privatisation, and it's to do with who controls what on the ground. So without any further ado, Ruth, I'm terribly pleased that we met many months ago, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing your work today, as will our members. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Barb. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see my slides now. So thank you, Karen and Barb, for the invite, and Play Australia for hosting this event. It's yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and thanks everyone for coming as well. And today, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about informal sports participation and the shifting sort of landscape of sports participation in Australia and internationally, and some of the implications of these shifts and changes. The data that I'm drawing on today is from a 3-year project that we're about 2 years into, give or take different disruptions for COVID, funded by the Australian Research Council and in partnership as well with the organisations listed on the bottom of the slide. So it's a real sort of partnership between different universities and industry partners. So just moving on. Again, to begin with, I want to acknowledge country and particularly acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation as the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University, where I'm at now, stands. And I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri and Bunurong elders and their past, present and future communities, and also extend that respect to any Indigenous people joining us on the online platform today. So just to begin with, informal sport and what is informal sport? What are we kind of talking about here? And as I'll go on and talk about in the presentation, informal sport covers a real broad spectrum of activities. In this project, we've specifically understood informal sport as individuals and groups who they're not affiliated to any particular traditional club structure. They're not affiliated with a governing body. They're self-organising their own participation, and they do so outside of traditional structures. One of the, I think the key things we were looking for was groups that weren't paying a sort of ongoing membership fee. That was a kind of key criteria for us. The groups may well pay to use facilities, and a lot of them often do, but they don't sort of have that membership structure that's characteristic of more traditional forms of sport. We've also within this project tended to focus mostly on informal opportunities that replicate formal sporting options, so things like cricket or soccer or basketball, rather than, for example, things like yoga groups that might come together informally in a public space, or fitness groups, but they could also come under this banner of informal sport. Activities like skateboarding and parkour also we could put under the informal sport banner, but we haven't necessarily focused on those types of activities within our particular project. So just to give a bit of a background and context to the project, I suppose the key sort of issues is the changing nature of society and contemporary society. Australian society in particular is becoming more culturally diverse. People are more time poor. There's different pressures within society on how we use our time. There's been the rise of digital technology, digital platforms, different ways that we connect and different ways that we come together, and a sort of move towards individualism and wanting to kind of engage with different activities in ways that suit us, fit our time scales, fit our needs, and have the sort of flexibility to be able to engage how and when we want. So these sort of broader changes that are happening in society have very much been recognised within Australian sports policy documentation to date. from the Future of Australian Sport report in 2013 sort of recognised this kind of shifting trends in how people want to participate. And if we look at the Sport Australia 2030 strategy, again, this real sort of recognition that society is changing, and the acknowledgement that sport needs to sort of connect with this and understand how sport might need to change to be able to meet the changing needs of society. So there's definitely been a sort of a strong acknowledgement across the sports sector that things are changing and sport might need to change. But what we were really sort of feeling when we put this project together was there wasn't necessarily much sort of understanding of how things might need to change, or indeed just understanding, well, if people are participating in different ways, how are they participating? And that's what really drove the project. Just some participation statistics, and I'll kind of go over kind of the key headlines in here. In terms of participation data, the ABS and the Ausplay statistics in recent years have demonstrated a decline or a sort of stagnation in formal sport participation. And the general figure is, as young people move into adulthood, only 26% of the population will participate in structured traditional forms of sport in adulthood over sort of a life course. So it's not an unsubstantial amount, it's still a quarter of the population, but it's, there's others that aren't participating in that space. There's also predictions that the participation of adults in formal sporting structures will continue to decline, and the Intergenerational Review of Australian Sport talked about a decline of 15% by 2036. I'll just move that down. So there's sort of this perception of declining, and that will continue. So in relation to these declines, what participation statistics are also suggesting to us is, whilst there's been this decline in participation in formal sport, there's been a rise in engagement in informal, unstructured forms of participation in sport and physical activity. Now, the data that's collected is quite blurry and quite difficult to sort of disentangle at times, because different types of activities get bundled in together. So it's hard to get an exact picture in relation to the specific type of informal sport that we're talking about. But the general picture of informal, self-generated, self-organised physical activity and sport is that it has increased over the last 5 to 10 years. This trend as well, it's prevalent within Australia, but it's an international trend. We're seeing it in many other countries. It's very prevalent in the UK. We're seeing it in European countries. New Zealand have also highlighted this shift, and Canada as well. So there's data coming that, this is sort of a significant phenomenon across different countries. The data collected by Sport England as well has been quite interesting in this space. And just putting this up as a sort of headline statement. So this is from the Active Live survey in England. And as you can see there, 1 million more people were active in 2018-19 than they were in 2015. So if we're talking about physical activity agendas, that's, a good sort of statistic. But in that time, 1 million less people played organised sport. So people are being more active, but they're not doing it necessarily in the organised sport space. So if we think of broader physical activity agendas, organised sport is definitely part of the picture and traditional forms of sport. But what we're sort of seeing through our data and through our project is that there's other types of participation in sport that can be equally valued and equally as important if we're thinking about those physical activity agendas. And so to really kind of engage with what sport can do to enhance physical activity, we really need to broaden our understanding of what we're thinking about sport and what sport is. So in terms of why informal sport is important and what led us to do the project, as I've mentioned, I think the key area of importance here is around the physical activity and health agendas. We know there's low levels of physical activity, and particularly low levels amongst populations who have intersecting factors that mean they're going to be less likely to be active, to have access to resources to be active. it's a key priority for many local government areas, and you know, a key part of sort of health and wellbeing plans. And, you know, rightly so in terms of the recognised benefits that physical activity can contribute to mental health, to physical health and social health. As we'll talk to in relation to informal sport, we have groups of people that are motivated to be active, they're trying to be active, but they're facing various constraints to doing this. So it's sort of an important message, I think, to put in the mix when we're thinking about physical activity promotion within our communities. Another area that we felt was important, and why we initially, you know, connected with Barb and Play Australia, was really sort of reconceptualising this participation and looking at the link between children's play and how that progresses into adulthood. So informal sport has many of the characteristics of children's play. It's essentially, you know, adults continuing to play in the way they did as children, but in their chosen sport. So again, thinking of that sports participation continuum and the play continuum, how can informal sport fit within that, and what does that mean, and how we support and sustain sports participation if we start to think of it more as a kind of play continuum rather than sort of moving into particular types of sport. There's also, we're finding a really strong relationship with traditional and structured forms of sport and informal participation. So several of the participants that we've spoken to do both forms. They might use informal groups to kind of continue to practice and develop their skills in off seasons. They might use it to sort of just have more opportunity to play the sport they want to play. There's also, I mean, if we sort of look at talent development in young people, I as a sort of coach of children's sport, I'm constantly encouraging children to play I coach cricket, to play cricket informally, to hone their skills, to develop their skills in an informal context. So there's a strong relationship between skill development, informal play and engagement, and even, you know, through to sort of talent identification. And soccer's been quite strong in really identifying those links and seeing it as an important part of the pathway. So there's real synergies and relationships between more, you know, structured forms of sport and informal participation that I think, again, it's really important to recognise and to see the value of informal sport in this place. Also, I think there's important aspects of informal sport for thinking about health and physical education in the curriculum we teach children at school. I'm from the Faculty of Education at Monash. And just thinking about, well, if adults aren't going to go on into traditional sporting structures, but they may well play informally, what skills do we need to equip children with to be able to continue to participate into adulthood? Are they sort of a different set of skills that we need to give them to be able to continue playing informally, to continue their play and to be able to do that into adulthood? So I think there's lots of different dimensions as to why informal sport is important, and many sort of different agendas that it speaks to. So that sort of led us to this research project, and these are the key aims of the project. The first was really around trying to understand this concept of informal sport. Who's doing it? How are they doing it? What are some of the benefits they gain from participating in informal activity? And there's very little sort of research data there was at the time in the Australian context that really was beginning to sort of dig deep into informal participation and find out more about it. So a key part of the project is really trying to build this evidence base of what's happening and what's the value of what's happening to local communities. And then from that, we were sort of very aware of the need, looking at the kind of current policy documentation and the recognition that key stakeholders had of this change, but also the need to provide research-informed information as to how we might be able to support and develop this type of participation. So we're sort of in the midst of that in the second part of the research project. The first part has really been the focus to date and what I'll talk about today, but there is the intention that we can, you know, develop resources and support from the data that we've collected. I'll just go very briefly through the methodology. We're working in two states, Victoria and Western Australia. And we've been doing several phases of data collection. We're sort of in the midst of phase 2 still at the moment, moving into the final phase later in this year. First phase was really a big sort of scoping data collection, talk with key stakeholders at the national, state, local government level, community groups, leaders of informal groups as well, and really trying to understand in that data collection sort of what was happening in informal sports spaces, what key stakeholders were seeing, what they were seeing as the key challenges, what were they seeing as the key affordances, and within that also doing a policy analysis of different policies within particularly local government level, but also at state level as well, and sort of again looking at, you know, where does informal sports sit within the current policy landscape of sport participation. The intention was for that phase to do the 60 interviews, but we ended up, I think with COVID helped us in this instance, we ended up speaking to over 100 different stakeholders because it was quite easy to sort of connect with people online, and people were really happy to talk to us. So that was great, and we've been able to get a really kind of comprehensive data set at that level. We've then been working in 4 local government areas as case study areas, our fantastic partners, and I can't thank enough the LGAs that have been involved in the study and just really helped support us through the work and guided us to different areas and given so much information to us. So we've got Casey and Hume in Victoria, and Canning and Stirling in Western Australia. And within each of those LGAs, we've targeted 4 sites where we, in conversation with the staff at the LGAs, we'd identified that informal sport was happening, and there was sort of, you know, activity there, groups would come, and these were all sorts of different facilities that we go to. Some were multi-use facilities, some were basketball courts, a couple of indoor facilities, and then cricket ovals, different sort of grass areas. So there was a real mix within there. And at those sites, we undertook observation using a SOPARC methodology, which is basically where you go and stand in those facilities for periods of time. We were there for a 2-week period and observing what's happening. So with this, we were really interested in who was coming, who was using the facility, the numbers, the types of people that were coming, the different groups that were using. And particularly for the informal groups we identified within those observations, we were also then collecting data on their physical activity levels during the time that they were engaged in informal activity, which will provide us with the data. We haven't yet done this, but provide us with data to be able to undertake a cost-benefit analysis of the value of that physical activity to the local community. So what we want to end up in that sort of third yellow stripe of data collection is be able to put a dollar figure on the value of informal sport for local communities in the same way that's been done with formal and traditional forms of sport. We've also done lots of interviews, and I'll talk to that data today, with the informal groups. The final phase, as I mentioned, is really about co-designing, going back to our stakeholders. And we've identified lots of challenges and issues, but what we really want to do with this project is say, okay, well, how do we overcome these? Let's use the expertise that's available and start to sort of problem solve and come up with solutions that we can then support, you know, different stakeholders with sort of thinking about how they might better support informal participation going forward. So in terms of the findings, I think one of the key things we found, and goes back to my earlier comments about defining informal sport, we've really seen that informal sport is a huge spectrum. There's a massive diversity in the types of participation, the groups we've connected with. And I'll talk a bit more about the composition of the groups in a minute, but we've seen lots of different activities, traditional cultural activities. We've got Afghan rock throwing group that play a game called Sangarag that meet regularly as one of the case studies. We've got a roller hockey group, basketball, ultimate frisbee. So there's all sorts of different groups that have been involved and that we've seen. There's also, we're seeing varying levels of informality through to much more formal groups. Some are literally, you know, they just rock up. It varies week to week what they're doing. They have WhatsApp groups and it's just sort of when the message goes out, they kind of turn up. Their location changes all the time, which was quite challenging for data collection, just trying to keep track of where groups were. And then through to ones that are actually very sort of structured and almost formalized in what they do. They have regular times that they meet, you know, regular communication systems. They might play in self-organized tournaments and leagues. They might have uniforms. So we really saw this sort of broad spectrum. And I think that the quote there from one of our stakeholders sort of talks to this and the implications of this about the need in terms of designing systems that's responsive to that spectrum and the sort of fact that opportunities and needs change over the life course within this space. How do we kind of design for that? So what we've kind of come to conclude from the data we've collected so far in this breadth of informal sport is the need to really see it as a significant part of the sports participation sector. It's in complementary and it intersects with formal sport. It contributes to multiple policy agendas from the data we've collected so far. And it needs to be very much recognised as part of sport participation and an important one as well. So in terms of who have we got and why are they doing it and what benefits? We've done around 60 interviews so far with informal sport participants. What we're seeing is the groups we're engaging with at the case study sites, they tend to be groups that are traditionally underrepresented in traditional sporting structures. So many culturally and linguistically diverse groups, many groups from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And they did sort of talk in their interviews about finding formal and traditional structures inaccessible for them often, or they'd not had great experiences in that setting. So that wasn't everyone, but that was sort of a theme that came through the data. In terms of the observations we've done so far, and looking at the usage of the sites we've been doing the observations at, it varied depending on the site, but we're coming in at the moment at around 30 to 40% of the usage of those facilities was by informal sport participants. So there's quite a big sort of chunk of usage of those facilities is by informal groups. Not all of them had traditional sporting groups that used them as well, so you couldn't necessarily make a comparison, but just thinking of, you know, who's using facilities and who's there, quite a big chunk of the 2 weeks that we observed was informal groups coming and using the facilities. And we're still in really early days of analysis of that data, but I think there's more to sort of we want to unpack there. One of the things in terms of who is important to talk to the gender balance. Certainly, there's more men than women engaging in informal opportunities, but women are there. What we've sort of found is that the women's groups it's slightly different in how they participate and where they participate. So the informal women's groups that we came across tended to have been driven by either an external sort of community organisation or by a kind of key significant leader who had, you know, really sort of brought people together and often booked facilities. There was a lot of women's groups tended to be in indoor facilities. So it was there. We sort of saw a real desire from the women we spoke to engage in informal sport, but certainly women are very much less likely than men to kind of go out and claim public space. So there's definitely gender issues to unpack, and again we're going to do that through some sort of targeted sampling over the next couple of months, and again looking to find more women's groups and sort of talk to them about how we might address some of the gender imbalances within this space. In terms of why the groups sort of talked about, many different reasons why. Key things that we'd expect: flexibility, the opportunity to drop in, drop out, work around shifts, commitments, family commitments. Generally, it was low cost or no cost. A key thing that came through as well was this notion of informal sport being able to foster a sense of inclusion in informal sports groups that suited that group. So that often related to things around ability. They made modifications, they adapted to suit the ability of the group. But it could also be around sort of cultural engagement and supporting different cultural groups to come together and feeling part of that space. So there was this real sort of desire to do informal sport because the group could kind of control that culture of inclusion. There was a strong sort of social drive as well, connection with friends, meet new people, bring people together, again similar to sort of what we'd find within traditional sporting structures. And again, a real passion for the sport, particularly the cricket groups that we spoke to. They just loved playing cricket. They loved sport and they wanted to do it. So a real sort of desire to be involved in sport. And in terms of the benefits, we've collected quite a lot of data around the social connections that people within the group feel they gain from their participation, the mental health and well-being benefits that participants gain from being physically active, from coming together in that social connection, and also the physical health benefits in terms of being able to, be physically active and be regularly physically active as well. So the sort of data was really rich in terms of the benefits that participants felt they gained from informal sport participation. So moving on now to talk to some of the kind of challenges and tensions that came up and were identified by both the stakeholders and the participants. The key issue came down to space, as Barb sort of said in the introduction. It was an ongoing tension for the groups was accessing space, facilities to be able to do their sport and do their activity. And there were a number of different dimensions to this that I'll sort of talk to in each, because each sort of has kind of different implications. So where groups have been trying to access facilities that were predominantly used by a mainstream sporting club, there seemed to be quite a lot of tension around who sort of had ownership of that space, who owned that facility, and difficulty in kind of trying to co-share the space. And again, the Sport 2030 plan has a big emphasis on the need to kind of co-share facilities and look at multiple uses of spaces. But I think at the very local level, it's important to recognise that there's considerable tensions in trying to do this. So the quote really sums it up from one of the LGA officers that we spoke to, and they were very aware and felt it was something that they were continually trying to manage this sense of ownership that clubs had and their dislike of letting informal groups use the facility. We had groups that talked about being moved on and pushed off the site by formal clubs and having to continually move to sort of different settings to play. One of the other things that came up, particularly in WA, was this issue of seasonal use of space and public facilities. So when goalposts came down, when cricket season started, that meant that people no longer had the facilities necessary to play, even though informal groups we found just want to play all year round. They don't want to stop for seasons, they don't work in a traditional sporting sense. There was also issues raised, and LGAs are sort of very open about this in terms of how they plan for usage, and often this can be done using historical planning data, who's used previously, and so therefore will continue using, and informal groups don't necessarily come into that context and that thinking. And also just the issue of data for LGAs came through time and time again about, well, these groups, if they don't book, they're sort of under the radar, there's no affiliation, we don't necessarily know they're there. We don't, and that makes it incredibly hard to then plan into usage and to think about how we might plan and support these groups. There was key issues raised around informal groups doing the wrong activity in the wrong spaces. And one example of this was our roller hockey group, who for many weeks had been booking a tennis court and doing their roller hockey on the tennis court. And then the club realised that they weren't actually hiring for a tennis group, they were hiring for a roller hockey group, even though, you know, there's sort of been no damage to it, but then stopped the group from using the facility because it's like, well, no, that we can't accommodate roller hockey at our tennis club. So also came through strongly was this notion of wrong people in different spaces, and within this very much groups talking about facing issues of racism, particularly the young African migrant groups that we had coming together. They talked about, you know, just public perception that they were there doing wrong things, creating disturbances, that they were, you know, a nuisance, they were a sort of an issue in the space that they were in. And again, the LGA staff we spoke to talked about fielding complaints of this nature that were kind of had clear sort of racial undertones and motivation in why people were upset about these groups being in certain public spaces. The other issue of space to talk to is just the sort of lack of facilities in some areas and the overcrowding. And this, you know, came through again with sort of many of the LGAs we spoke to, just the challenges they face in catering for mainstream sport and traditional forms of sport in some instances, and therefore where informal sport fits within that. And it kind of falls down the pecking order because, you know, everyone that's trying to do sport seems to be trying to fight for different facilities. And informal groups have the least advocacy in this. They have the least sort of political power to influence decisions on facility building and facility development. So then issues around legislation, policy and funding, and these again were key. The top one there about insurance just came through time and time again, and I know everyone's sort of working in an LGA context will resonate with. So for many of the groups, even if they sort of wanted to formally book facilities and pay to use facilities, and they could, they needed to have public liability insurance to be able to do that. And the cost of that was prohibitive for most groups. And it sort of went against the ethos of how they wanted to participate. You know, they didn't want to be having to pay that sort of fee to be able to do it. Again, this was one of the sort of initial reasons why we connected with Barb and Play Australia, was to start trying to brainstorm this issue and to look at alternatives and think, well, how does insurance work within the play sector? And we've been looking at other sort of models and things like park run and how does insurance work there, and different sort of ways of thinking about, well, how can we support insurance within the informal sport participation area? So even one of the other sort of things that came through as well was, as I mentioned, policies that prioritise existing users, and for new users are only considered through the existing system. So the quote here from one of the policy documents in one of our LGAs talks about new user groups having to submit an EOI, and that the council will then work with the State Sporting Association to confirm new user groups. So obviously that kind of shuts any informal groups out straight away because they won't be registered with the State Sporting Association. Related to the sort of issue with data and not having good figures on the number of informal sport participation, that then makes it hard to consider informal groups within existing funding systems. You know, to distribute money, you need structure, you need systems, and you need accountability, of which informal groups just can't provide that by their very nature. So the current funding structure just can't really account for informal groups. The final point, which was one that our LGA stakeholders really sort of talked to us a lot about and kind of, you know, really kind of problematized and found a difficult sort of concept to get to grips with, was the idea of how much the facilities that they oversee are community facilities and how much they're commercial assets. And many of the staff we talked to said, you know, there's competing demands within their LGA about using facilities to for economic benefit to be commercial entities versus trying to, you know, use them to support the local community. And they felt that, you know, that was a really key tension. And several groups we spoke to had sort of been impacted by a kind of commercialisation of resources, where there was one basketball group who had used the basketball court for several years, and then a sort of charge was put on that, and they just couldn't afford to pay the charge. They were overseen by a community organisation that had the necessary insurance, but they just couldn't afford to pay the charge anymore. So a key sort of set of tensions there. So just in the last few minutes of the presentation, just want to sort of look sort of more positively. So there's various tensions, various constraints facing informal sports groups. But also what we've seen is the groups themselves and also key stakeholders have been very kind of innovative in the way they're trying to respond to this. And we've seen, you know, different examples of things that have been done that have helped informal sports groups to continue to participate. We've seen examples where not-for-profit community groups have come in and effectively auspiced informal groups. So they've come under their banner. That's then allowed them to book facilities. It's negated the insurance issue. That's sort of been one way that some groups have got around that. We've also had key leaders acting as sort of a bridge in navigating the different tensions. So we had a women's futsal group where the leader there had really sort of worked with a local facility on booking the facility. She'd negotiated that every week. She'd managed to get sponsorship from local organisations to pay for the facility, and just sort of was really key as a person kind of helping to navigate this, which other informal groups don't necessarily have that key individual person. We've seen different responses from sports associations, and have been incredibly innovative. Tennis have got a system now, a kind of book a court system, where you can just go online, book a local court, and you get a PIN number that you go and then can just type the PIN number in and you can go and use it. So that's been a sort of just one response from a sport in terms of thinking about, well, how can we harness this sort of informal casual usage better? We've also been looking at sports that do have this annual low-cost memberships that cover insurance. So sports such as cycling and triathlon, and seeing what can we take from there that might be usable in a wider informal sports setting. We've also seen councils really focusing on how do we activate low usage spaces, and some of the things they've done have been quite simple in terms of, you know, if we look at what informal groups want generally in public spaces, they want the space to do their sport, but they also want some toilets and some water fountains. So a couple of the LGAs have put toilet blocks into certain areas, and it's, you know, helped increase and support the informal usage that's been there. One of our LGAs talked about leaving lights on for longer at one of their facilities to allow groups to participate into the evening. So quite sort of simplistic solutions, but made a huge impact on the groups that were there. And then certainly in terms of talking with the LGAs, kind of moving forward, this move and recognition towards much more holistic planning, looking at the bigger picture of new facilities, considering things like dual usage and how those facilities are going to work within the communities that they're located, is certainly sort of happening. We've also got examples where groups have accessed school spaces, and I think there's potentially big potential there in terms of being able to activate school spaces. It's not without its tensions, but we've seen great examples where that's worked really well. And also LGA's talked about that notion of, you know, not having a facility that's only for one sport, having multi-use facilities that can be used all year round and in all weather. And there's definitely been, I think, a shift amongst sort of talking to our LGA partners about this recognition of that whole of system planning and how important that's going to be in supporting informal sport participation. So just to conclude, in terms of implications so far of the project and where we're going next, I think the key implication, and again, it seems quite a basic point, but just greater understanding of informal sport and greater recognition of informal sport as part of a sport participation spectrum is going to be really important going forward. And within that, then raising awareness of the importance and consideration of policy, and that's at all levels, as how does informal sport interact with our existing policy, and how might we better use policy to support informal opportunities. Again, there's been implications in relation to funding and how funding might better support informal groups. And some of that has been through perhaps working through these community organisations that do auspice some groups. And then key in relation to space and thinking about who can access sporting space, what's the sort of legislation that keep people in and out of space. And a key for us moving forward is really problem solving the issues and challenges that we've been seeing. We've got sort of some ideas, but we really want to kind of work with the stakeholders that we've been talking with to sort of say, okay, well, how can we best overcome some of these considerable challenges? So that moving forward is where we're going next with the project. Still some data analysis and that cost benefit analysis to do. And then we'll be very much sort of working in a co-design process with our key stakeholders and looking at what solutions we can come up with at all levels and resources to support all organisations across the sector with being able to recognise and support informal sport going forward. We're really passionate about this area. We think informal sport is important and valuable to communities, and we want to help key stakeholders be able to allow people to just play and be active in ways they want to be in their local community. I'll finish up there. Thanks, Barb. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Ruth. You've probably given us all our workload for the next 10 years, if not the 20 years. But I think your presentation in bringing up the barriers and also providing with a whole range of positive actions is really incredibly helpful. We at Play Australia see play as very much part of this whole debate, just as you do. We're very connected with the need to increase the physical activity levels of the country's kids and therefore adults. And so I think your work is just unbelievably important. I was reminded, and I won't tell you who, but she will know who she is, one of our life members who's with us today. I remember her telling me how in her local park there was a sign that said no ball games allowed. Yeah. Now, I must say she took no notice of that, as her family and the neighbour's family used to play soccer very regularly. But you know, from the tiniest thing like that, we can make a change almost overnight. I know there are lengthy contracts involved with sporting clubs, and they, of course, are very much more difficult to amend. But it sure is the agenda, and I would really hope that Sport and Rec and the Victorian government in particular would take this issue up, because this government is supportive of practices that are inclusive of everybody. But in effect, and I'll be more blunt than Ruth will be, we have in effect privatised Crown land across Victoria by giving it to sporting clubs and saying, you can decide who plays, you can decide what they will pay to play, when they will play, and how they will play. And everybody else just kind of has to fit in with that, or else they don't participate. So it's a huge issue for the community. I must say I'm delighted that my friend Dennis Moriarty, who is the leader of our community, is really taken by this issue in terms of a social index that is able to actually monitor who gets access to public space and who doesn't. So it's a huge issue. But enough from me. Karen, over to you.
I've actually just put in the chat a suggestion that if someone wanted to raise their hand and ask a question, and Jennifer, I can see that you've raised your hand. Can you press your unmute and perhaps you'd like to ask your question directly to Ruth?
Yeah, hi Ruth. Really interesting chat. I work in as a landscape architect in the area of land development. I think probably from my perspective is this increasing demand on open space, recreational open space for community use and for family use, because of the increasing density, is only going to be something that increases over time. So I think it's really important that we as a group have these discussions, because otherwise you're ending up with a lot of people that don't get access to nature, they don't get access to community and social connectedness. So there's a bit bigger well-being discussion that comes out of this as to how we move into the future and get that more informal use into these spaces. From my experience, and I've worked in sports and recreation as part of landscape architecture as well, is that a lot of the funding that's available goes to structured sports, and there isn't anything left to provide for those more informal spaces by the time the end of the project comes along. We do what we can as landscape architects, but it's not always easy. So I just wondered if any work, if for the future proofing of it, has been done to date.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I think you've made some, really key and important points there. Certainly in relation to the funding split, when we've got a case study LGAs, but we talked to a number of other LGAs as part of the stakeholder interviews, and they sort of talked about this 70-30 split in funding in relation to facilities, with 70% being targeted towards the sort of structured traditional side of facility development. So I think the issue you've raised definitely is there. I think in terms of future proofing, what we've sort of been finding is all kind of different stakeholders in the piece there. We've been talking with developers as well about how they sort of, they have certain clauses about green space within sites that they're developing. So how do they actually then frame and think about those green sites, and how can sort of informal sport be continued in the mix there? But I think there's definitely, in terms of what needs to come out of this project, is sort of some guidance in that area as well. And it's a key issue moving forward in terms of how we think about the new spaces that we're developing, and was key for the two LGAs that we were working with in Victoria, which are rapidly expanding LGAs and a lot of new developments and new builds.
Thank you, Ruth. I've got a question here from Elizabeth Dudley Bestow. To what extent do you think informal users need the formal sport settings? Can we give them smaller, sloping, spare spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many of the groups that we work with didn't necessarily need formal traditional settings at all. They just needed something that was a space. Most of them wanted flat spaces, so probably not the sloping element, but there's the smaller element definitely particularly works. So, for soccer groups, they wanted smaller spaces. They wanted quick, fast fire games that you can do in smaller spaces because there's less distance to pass and things. So I think there's certainly an element, and we've been working with the LGAs on this, about looking at where are other spaces, like this whole notion of underutilized spaces, where are underutilized spaces that, maybe don't have those things like the toilet or the water fountain, and where we can put those in, and then informal groups would use those spaces. So I don't think there's any sort of, some groups would obviously prefer to have those traditional sporting facilities, but it's certainly not essential. And for our Sangarag group, they just wanted a flat strip of land, which they'd undertake their activity in, and that was all they needed, and a bench for some of them to sort of sit on whilst the game was taking place. So I think we can definitely look at different forms of spaces within this as well. Thanks for the question, Elizabeth.
That's great, Ruth. Thank you. Ruth, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what would be one key message that you would like the people attending today to take away?
I just, for me, it is around that sort of recognition of the broadening of how we understand sport within society, within our systems, within the way we plan and the way we support sport. You know, sport's a wonderful part of our culture. It's a wonderful part of who we are as a society. But just being more willing to embrace that there's different forms, and they're all as important and they're all as valuable to communities. So we don't want to just support one particular form, just widening out that support where possible. I think that's the sort of key thing that we're getting from this project, is that it's just reconceptualizing how we see sport and therefore how we support it and develop it to really work to what communities want.
Ruth, I'm mindful that many people who weren't able to come today, everybody, by the way, Ruth has very kindly agreed to let us share the recording of today, which is just terrific. But I think the information is so significant that I think we need to consciously share it with everybody that we think will have an interest and a role in this. I'm thinking about the open space planning requirements, and as Jennifer said, the need for open space is going to be dramatically different in 5 years, 10 years time than what it has been historically. And so the planning laws have to be changed by the state government. The funding laws have to be changed. And I guess the other issue that I acknowledge that is very difficult, and that is the political one, because we know that sport people are very powerful politically, be it at the local level or at the Sport Australia level. And it is very difficult to say to a sporting club that they have to share their car park with anybody else. And I've witnessed these experiences at the City of Maribyrnong some years ago, the City of Melbourne in particular. People believe that they own what is in fact public space. And so it's a job for all of us. I'm wondering, Ruth, how people can keep in touch with you and the project. I appreciate that you probably don't want hundreds of emails every week, but having said that, I know that our members in particular, and people who are very much part of Mandy Knowlton's Rec People's network, will be really, are in fact, really committed to dealing with these issues. And so it would be terrific if we could have a means of people communicating. Do you have any suggestions as to how we might do that?
I mean, I'm more than happy for people to get in touch with me directly. My sort of details are on the presentation slides, and I really welcome that. I particularly love when people get in touch and sort of share examples of, you know, different forms of informal sport that they're seeing or experiences. It just helps build the picture, really. So, yeah, more than happy for people to get in touch directly. And then we've got a project website that, again, is on the slides, and we put updates on that. We've got sort of blog pieces and our reports, and academic publications also go on that as well. And our sort of Twitter account, Informal Sport, is also sort of where we kind of post updates and information and have different kind of conversations in the online space. So, but yeah, more than happy for people to connect. And
Ruth, that's fantastic. That is just really wonderful. And so I can imagine that lots of people will be being in touch with you. Now
We've actually got two more quick questions,
Karen.
Barb. Is that okay?
Yep, of
Ruth,
course,
you have just quickly. Rob Walton is asking, what mindset shift do you think LGAs have to make in order to? Oh, you've just shifted there. There we go. Sorry about that. In order to provide better and innovative, informal, active rec facilities? And there's another question too from Debbie Hall. Has the research included conversations with sporting organisations to identify their concerns and the reasons behind them? So yeah, what do LGAs have to do to change their mindset?
Yeah, and I think, I think it's sort of understanding as well that there's different, LGAs are very big organisations, and there's different perspectives within organisations. So the people that we're connecting with most and are helping us with the project are doing so because they believe it's important. So there's not a mindset shift needed there. They're very engaged in this space. But I think what they're sort of talking to us about is I think it's the higher level up in the organisation that needs to shift and sort of reconsider. And certainly sort of the re-education of facility planning teams, of those that are involved more in traditional sports development systems as well, of actually kind of getting different groups to talk to each other. Many of the LGA interviews talked about this sort of idea of silos across the organisation, so they don't necessarily connect and talk with each other. So there's certainly I think everyone we spoke to talked about that need for a greater communication, and that definitely is a kind of mindset shift in how people have traditionally worked. They need to kind of work differently. So I think there's that work to be done. But again, for those that were involved, that was an important part of having this research, was to be able to go and lobby and to use the evidence to be able to say, this is important, we need to engage with this, and these are some ways that we can do this. I'm hoping that the research can help with that mind shift as well. Debbie's
organisations.
Yeah, Debbie's question about the sporting organisations. Yeah, I mean, the sporting organisations have definitely been a very strong part of the stakeholder interviews. We've talked to different sporting organisations, and we've also talked to clubs, and particularly talking with clubs about issues of sort of sharing space and, how they're seeing it, what are the issues they're seeing. And it really does come down to, it's sort of different in different parts, but some of it is around, wear and tear of facilities. There's concern about that by the clubs. There's also sort of, concern about, well, we're paying money to use these facilities. We're having to do this. We're having to go through all these regulations and compliance, and it's costly. And these groups are just turning up and using it. They don't pay anything, and it's, issues of fairness kind of come through there. So there's sort of different tensions that I think clubs see, some of them justified, others not, that sort of, again, perhaps needs a bit more engagement with the community sports sector as to what some of the benefits are of actually engaging with an informal group, and having them as part of sort of the space that you share and you work on together, play on together.
Thank you, Ruth. And Barb, I'll hand over to you now.
Karen, I saw another question from Joey Boothby.
From Joey, yes.
Is that possible?
Is it difficult it is difficult to engage with some informal recreation groups as they operate under the radar and may not have a profile or organised structure? Very true.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's been one of the challenges for the research, was some groups really just didn't want to engage with us. They've been used to being pushed on. They don't want to be known about. They want to come and use the facilities they're using in the way they're using them and not draw attention to themselves. And say we had one group that we must have had to track around 8 different locations just because they kept getting moved on. So that again presents challenges for those planning and trying to support, but I think it's also looking at why they're moving on and how we can address that issue, which would then make the sort of planning and support system easier.
And if councils have a policy coming from the top that they want all of their ratepayers to be able to participate, then that would send a message that there needs to be avenues for them to be able to do that. Ruth, thank you. You've provided some absolutely amazing insights into what is, in fact, everybody who's here today work. This is what our people do, and it is very difficult. There is no suggestion that these things can be changed overnight. But the no ball games allowed signs on bits of grass, that they can actually be changed. So Ruth, thank you very much, and we will forward your presentation to people later today. Before we go, can I tell you that for next week, for our full benefits members, that is largely our local governments and industry members, we're going to be focusing on playground standards. We always have a session, or I probably should say risk management, of which standards is just a part. Rob Hamilton is going to give us a presentation around the issue of ground surfacing, one of my very favourite topics, and various members of the Playground Standards Committee will be available to respond to people's questions and issues. So if you're thinking in your work that you've got questions you'd like answered around particular risk management issues, get them to us even before next Thursday so that we can make sure that we get to them in plenty of time. Registration details are on the website as usual. So that's it from us, everybody. Thank you again, Ruth. It was wonderful. And we hope to see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.